The morning mist clung to the Italian hillside as Hauptmann Friedrich Müller studied the intelligence report with growing concern. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the document down and gazed across the command tent at his fellow officers. "They're bringing in Gurkha regiments," he said quietly. The silence that followed was heavy with dread. Among the hardened Wehrmacht officers, the mere mention of these Nepalese warriors fighting for the British caused a chill that even the winter of '43 couldn't match. The reputation of the Gurkhas had spread through the German ranks like wildfire since the North African campaigns. These fierce fighters from the Himalayan mountains had been serving the British crown since 1815, earning a reputation for unwavering loyalty, extraordinary courage, and most terrifyingly, their deadly proficiency with the curved kukri knife. Stories told of how, once drawn, the kukri could not be resheathed until it had tasted blood. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann had dismissed such tales as Allied propaganda when he first arrived at the Italian front. Fresh from officer training and full of National Socialist fervor, he believed German superiority would prevail against any foe. "Surely these colonial troops cannot stand against proper German discipline," he had boasted during his first officer briefing. The older officers had exchanged knowing glances but said nothing. They had faced the Gurkhas in North Africa. They knew better. The British 4th Indian Division, which included several Gurkha battalions, had been deployed to the mountains of central Italy, where the terrain resembled their Himalayan homeland. This was no coincidence. British commanders understood that in such territory the Gurkhas were nearly unstoppable. Small in stature but powerful in build, they moved through mountain terrain with supernatural ease, even carrying heavy equipment up slopes that exhausted other soldiers. German intelligence had compiled detailed reports on all Allied units, but information on Gurkha tactics remained frustratingly incomplete. Survivors of engagements spoke of shadows that moved silently through the night, of sentries found with their throats cut without a sound of alarm ever being raised. Most disturbing were reports of German positions being infiltrated, with such stealth that the first indication of Gurkha presence was often the cold kiss of steel against a sentry's throat. The first significant encounter between Hoffmann's company and a Gurkha battalion came during an April offensive. German forces had established defensive positions along a strategic ridge, confident in their superior firepower and elevated position. As dusk fell, Hoffmann walked the line, ensuring his men remained vigilant. The attack began not with the expected artillery barrage, but with eerie silence. Sentries on the perimeter simply stopped reporting in. When the main assault came, it was with a blood-chilling battle cry, "Ayo Gorkali!" "The Gurkhas are coming!" That seemed to freeze the blood of even veteran German soldiers. They emerged from the darkness like wraiths, kukris glinting in the moonlight. Their speed and ferocity overwhelmed the German defenses before proper responses could be organized. By dawn, the ridge had fallen, and Hoffmann found himself retreating with the shattered remnants of his company. During that same campaign, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Schäfer was captured when Gurkhas infiltrated his headquarters during a nighttime raid. Later exchanged in a prisoner swap, his debriefing provided rare first-hand accounts of Gurkha methods. "They move like ghosts," he reported to the high command. No sound, no hesitation. The sentry beside me was there one moment, gone the next. I didn't even hear him fall. Schäfer, a decorated officer with experience on both Eastern and Western fronts, made an unprecedented request following his return: reassignment to any front where Gurkha units were not deployed. Throughout the summer of 1944, fear spread among German units. Reports circulated of Gurkhas collecting the watches of German officers they had killed, not as mere souvenirs, but as a methodical accounting of their effectiveness. Whether true or embellished, such stories had a devastating effect on morale. German soldiers began to request transfers when intelligence indicated Gurkha units were in their sector. Some officers reportedly fell ill with mysterious ailments when facing deployment against these feared adversaries. The Monte Cassino campaign demonstrated the Gurkhas' capabilities on a larger scale. When conventional Allied attacks failed to dislodge entrenched German positions, Gurkha battalions were deployed to scale the seemingly impassable cliffs on the enemy's flanks. German defenders had considered these approaches so difficult that they were left lightly guarded. Under cover of darkness, Gurkhas ascended these precipitous slopes, hauling heavy weapons by hand. The Germans awakened to find themselves under attack from positions they had thought unreachable. A Wehrmacht captain's diary, recovered after the battle, contained a telling entry. The men are more afraid of the Gurkhas than of artillery barrages. Artillery, at least, is impersonal. The Gurkhas are like hunting wolves who select their prey. To be their target is to know true fear. Psychological assessments conducted by German medical officers noted increasing cases of combat stress specifically associated with deployment against Gurkha units. Hans Brauer, a Feldwebel in an Alpine division, survived an encounter that became infamous throughout the German forces. "We were considered mountain specialists," he recounted after the war. "But in the Italian heights we met our masters. They came through a snowstorm, moving faster uphill than we could move on level ground. Our machine guns opened fire too late. They were already among us with those terrible knives. Of Brauer's 40-man platoon, only 7 survived. The psychological impact extended beyond the frontline troops to the command structure." Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy, noted in his memoirs the special challenges posed by Gurkha units. They inspired a form of anxiety different from that caused by Allied material superiority. It was primal, a fear of facing warriors for whom modern warfare had not dulled ancient fighting virtues. German intelligence officers attempted to develop effective countermeasures. They studied patterns of Gurkha deployments, analyzed their tactics, and trained special units in night fighting. Yet the most common response remained avoidance when possible. A classified directive issued to corps commanders in early 1945 advised, where identified, Gurkha units should be engaged primarily through ranged artillery and air support, minimizing close-quarter engagements. Even in captivity, Gurkha prisoners unnerved their German guards. A report from a POW camp administrator described how German sentries requested additional personnel when guarding Gurkha prisoners. They do not attempt escape as frequently as other Allied prisoners, but when they do, they are almost always successful and usually fatal to those who attempt to stop them. What made the Gurkhas so formidable was not merely their fighting prowess, but their absolute commitment. While other Allied soldiers fought for various ideals or simply to return home, the Gurkhas fought for honor and the warrior tradition that defined their culture. Their loyalty to their British officers was legendary, as was their seeming indifference to danger. German psychological warfare, so effective against some Allied units, found no purchase with the Gurkhas. As the war in Italy progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, a grudging respect emerged among German commanders for their Gurkha adversaries. General von Senger und Etterlin, who faced them at Monte Cassino, later wrote, "In the Gurkhas, we encountered not just soldiers, but a warrior tradition thousands of years old. Their commitment to their craft was total. One must respect such dedication, even in an enemy. The legacy of fear left by the Gurkhas extended beyond the war." In veteran associations and memoirs, German soldiers who served in Italy often recounted their encounters with these fearsome fighters from Nepal. What began as tactical assessments evolved into almost mythological narratives, cementing the Gurkhas' reputation as among the most formidable soldiers of the Second World War. As for Oberleutnant Hoffmann, his journey came full circle. The young officer who had once dismissed the Gurkhas became one of many German commanders who specifically requested reassignment away from areas where Gurkha units operated. His final report before transfer contained a warning to his replacement. "Respect them as you would respect death itself, for in many ways they are one and the same to us now." After the war, Gurkha regiments continued their service with the British Army, maintaining their traditions and fearsome reputation. Their kukris remained as sharp, their resolve as unbreakable as when they had haunted the nightmares of German officers in the mountains of Italy. The quiet, tough men from Nepal had written their place in military history not through brutality, but through skill, courage, and a warrior ethos that transcended the modern battlefield. And in the veterans' halls of Germany, for decades after the guns fell silent, one could still elicit a knowing silence by simply mentioning the Gurkhas. In the final desperate months of the Italian campaign, as Allied forces pushed northward, the Wehrmacht's fear of the Gurkhas evolved into a strategic liability. Intelligence officers began noting a concerning pattern. German units would sometimes abandon otherwise defensible positions upon merely receiving reports that Gurkha battalions were in the vicinity. High Command issued strict orders against such tactical adjustments, as they were euphemistically called, threatening severe punishment for officers who retreated without direct engagement. Feldmarschall Kesselring personally intervened after a particularly egregious incident near Bologna in February 1945, where a battalion-sized unit abandoned a vital crossroads position based solely on reconnaissance reports of Gurkha movements nearby. The commanding officer, Major Dieter Klug, was court-martialed, but offered a defense that resonated with many. "I preserved my men from certain annihilation. The Gurkhas don't take prisoners when they attack at night." While not entirely true, Gurkhas did indeed take prisoners when tactically feasible. Such beliefs had become gospel among German forces. The psychological operation officers of the Wehrmacht studied this phenomenon with growing alarm. A classified report from March 1945 noted, "The mythologizing of enemy capabilities presents a greater threat to our defensive capabilities than their actual combat effectiveness." Yet attempts to counter this psychological impact failed spectacularly. When propaganda officers distributed pamphlets describing the Gurkhas as simple colonial troops with no special abilities, soldiers who had faced them openly mocked such claims. A Gebirgsjäger, mountain infantry sergeant, was recorded saying, "Let the officers who write such nonsense spend one night on sentry duty when the Gurkhas are coming. Then they can tell us how ordinary these devils are." The 2nd Gurkha Rifles. Action at Monte Sol in the autumn of 1944 became particularly notorious. German forces had established artillery positions on this commanding height, well protected by interlocking fields of fire and extensive minefields. Previous Allied assaults had been repulsed with heavy casualties. Rather than attempt another frontal attack, the Gurkhas deployed a small infiltration team of just 16 men. Moving through gaps in the German lines identified by aerial reconnaissance, this team navigated the minefields by observing wildlife movements, a technique developed in the hills of Nepal for avoiding natural hazards. They ascended the steepest face of the mountain, considered impassable by German defenders. Over 2 nights, the team systematically eliminated key outposts, created gaps in the defensive perimeter, and planted explosives in ammunition dumps. When the main attack came on the 3rd night, German defenders found their carefully planned defensive network compromised at critical points. Ammunition dumps exploded simultaneously, communication lines had been cut, and key heavy weapon positions were mysteriously unmanned. Their crews found later with the distinctive wounds of kukri attacks. A German artillery officer captured. In this action, Lieutenant Otto Weber later described in his interrogation the peculiar horror of knowing the Gurkhas were in your position. "It was the silence that undid us. With Russians or Americans, you hear them coming, shouting, firing, the crash of vehicles. With the Gurkhas, the first sign is when the man beside you makes a small sound and is suddenly gone. You fire at shadows, and always, you feel watched." The psychological warfare went both ways. British commanders, recognizing the value of the Gurkhas' fearsome reputation, deliberately spread stories of their prowess. Before major operations, they would sometimes arrange for Gurkha units to be spotted near sectors they had no intention of attacking, drawing German reserves away from the actual objectives. Gurkha soldiers themselves contributed to this mystique, sometimes deliberately leaving signs of their presence, a discarded matchstick, a footprint deliberately preserved in mud, or most effectively, the kukri mark, a distinctive notch cut into wood or soft metal with their knives. German sentries who found such marks often deserted their posts, knowing what such tokens portended. By early 1945, the impact had reached the highest levels of German command in Italy. A meeting between Kesselring and his corps commanders in February included a remarkable exchange, preserved in the minutes. "If the British deploy their Gurkha regiments for the spring offensive, what special measures do you recommend?" asked Kesselring. General von Vietinghoff replied, "Artillery concentrations on likely approach routes. They cannot be effectively engaged by ordinary infantry tactics." Another commander suggested deploying elite mountain troops from Austria with specific anti-Gurkha training. This anti-Gurkha training became a priority for the remaining German special forces. The Brandenburger Regiment, Germany's dedicated special operations unit, developed a countering doctrine based on their own infiltration tactics. They studied what reports they could gather and interviewed survivors of Gurkha attacks. The resulting manual, Countermeasures Against Special Enemy Units, dedicated an entire chapter to Gurkha tactics without ever explicitly naming them, referring instead to mountain infantry units of the Indian divisions. The recommended countermeasures revealed the depth of German concern: triple the normal sentry postings, rotation of guards every 30 minutes instead of the usual 2 hours, use of tripwires connected to flares at irregular patterns around positions, patrolling in groups never smaller than 4, and most tellingly, the abandonment of fixed defensive lines in favor of mutually supporting strong points with overlapping fields of fire. An NCO instructor at a German mountain warfare school near Mittenwald was recorded telling his students, "Forget everything you know about night fighting. When facing these particular enemies, assume you are the hunted, not the hunter. Your advantage lies solely in firepower. Never allow them to close distance." As the Allied advance continued through northern Italy in the spring of 1945, German attempts to counter Gurkha tactics occasionally succeeded. Near Lake Garda, a German mountain battalion commanded by Major Klaus Brenner implemented the new Chow defensive doctrine effectively, repulsing a Gurkha night attack with concentrated machine gun fire triggered by flare positions. Brenner's after-action report became required reading for units and sectors where Gurkha regiments operated. Yet for every successful defense, there were multiple devastating encounters. The 6th Gurkha Rifles' action at Medicina in April 1945 demonstrated their adaptability. When German forces began implementing their new anti-infiltration measures, the Gurkhas simply adjusted their approach. Rather than their usual silent infiltration, they launched a direct assault after a brief but intense artillery barrage. German defenders, having prepared for stealth attacks, were instead overwhelmed by the ferocity of the Gurkhas in direct combat. A German doctor who treated casualties from this engagement noted in his medical report, "Wounds distinctive of hand-to-hand combat, primarily upper body and throat. Many defensive wounds on hands and forearms. Most victims show evidence of attempting to parry downward strikes, suggesting they faced opponents of smaller stature attacking with extreme speed. Individual Gurkha soldiers became legendary among German units." A senior NCO with the 8th Gurkha Rifles, Rifleman Banbagta Gurung, single-handedly neutralized 5 machine gun positions during the advance on Mandalago, continuing his assault despite being wounded twice. News of his actions spread through German communication channels as an example of what a single Gurkha soldier could accomplish. The 10th Gurkha Rifles became particularly feared for their reconnaissance capabilities. German signal intelligence intercepted British communications referring to the Phantoms, a special scout section who specialized in deep penetration of German lines. They would move as much as 20 kilometers behind the front, gathering intelligence and sometimes eliminating high-value targets before melting away. German counterintelligence never captured a single member of this unit despite numerous operations designed specifically for this purpose. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann, who had once dismissed the Gurkhas as mere colonial troops, experienced a profound change in perspective after surviving the fighting retreat from the Gothic Line. Reassigned to a staff position after requesting transfer, his analytical reports to High Command shed light on the German military's institutional perspective. In April 1945, he wrote, "We have failed to understand a fundamental truth about these adversaries. They do not fight merely because they are ordered to, or even for abstract concepts of duty and country as our soldiers do. They fight because they are warriors in the ancient sense, men for whom combat is a calling rather than an obligation." As the war in Italy neared its conclusion, German units began surrendering in unprecedented numbers, particularly to conventional British and American forces, rather than risk encounters with Gurkha patrols. A telling signal intercept from late April 1945 captured a German company commander's transmission to his battalion headquarters. "Enemy approaching from the south. Appears to be Gurkha advance elements. Request immediate permission to withdraw to secondary positions." The response was equally revealing. Permission granted. Priority is preservation of combat capability. The Gurkhas' psychological impact extended beyond combat encounters. German prisoners reported that rotation into sectors where Gurkha units operated was used as a punishment for units that had performed poorly elsewhere. A Luftwaffe ground crew transferred to infantry duty after their airfield was destroyed described their commanding officer's announcement: "You have failed the Führer in the air. Now you will face the consequences on the ground, in the eastern sector where the Gurkhas operate." The deeper reality behind the Gurkhas' effectiveness lay not just in their combat skills, but in their cultural approach to warfare. Unlike European soldiers fighting far from home for political objectives they might only vaguely understand, the Gurkhas fought as their ancestors had for centuries. Their martial tradition emphasized not just physical techniques, but a philosophical approach to combat that European soldiers found alien and therefore terrifying. A captured British officer, during interrogation by German intelligence, perhaps explained it best. "You're asking the wrong questions. You want to know about their tactics, their weapons, their organization. What you should be asking is why they fight as they do." The answer is simple. For them, being a warrior is not a profession or a duty. It is an identity. They don't fear death in battle because in their culture, such a death is the fulfillment of purpose, not its negation. As the war in Europe approached its final days, Gurkha battalions were preparing for deployment to the Pacific Theater when news of Germany's surrender arrived. Veterans of the Italian campaign were granted leave to their home villages in Nepal, carrying with them not just campaign medals and pay, but also the watches, badges, and occasionally the ceremonial daggers of German officers they had encountered. In the mountain villages of Nepal, these trophies became tangible links to distant battles fought for reasons few villagers fully understood. Young boys would gather around veterans to hear tales of the faraway mountains of Italy that somewhat resembled their own homeland, and of the strange, tall enemies who had learned to fear the warriors of Nepal. After the war, German military studies analyzed the psychological impact of specialized enemy units. A comprehensive report completed in 1947 by former Wehrmacht psychological operations officers, now working under Allied supervision, concluded, "No other Allied formation inspired comparable levels of anxiety among German troops." This was particularly remarkable given that Gurkha units were relatively few in number compared to conventional British, American, and Soviet formations. The report further noted, "The fear inspired was qualitatively different from that associated with artillery bombardment or air attacks. Those fears were impersonal, the fear of random death from above. Fear of the Gurkhas was intimate and primal, the fear of being personally hunted by an implacable predator. Many soldiers reported recurrent nightmares in which they were stalked through darkness by unseen enemies." Gurkha service with the British Army continued long after World War II, through numerous conflicts including Malaya, Borneo, and the Falklands. Their reputation remained intact, a fact noted by Argentine officers after the 1982 conflict who commented on the distinct change in morale among their troops when word spread that Gurkha units had landed on the islands. The tradition continues to this day, with young men from Nepal's mountains still competing fiercely for the limited positions available in the Brigade of Gurkhas. The selection process remains among the most physically demanding in any army worldwide, with candidates required to run uphill for kilometers, carrying heavy loads in baskets supported by head straps, the same method their forefathers used to move supplies through the Himalayan mountains. Perhaps the most telling testament to the Gurkhas' impact comes from a memoir published in 1980 by a former Wehrmacht officer who had served in Italy. 40 years later, I still dream of them. Not the Americans with their overwhelming firepower, nor the British with their stubborn determination. It is the Gurkhas who move through my nightmares. I wake in cold sweat, hearing nothing but knowing they are near. Some fears, once embedded in the soul, never truly leave. The legacy of the Gurkhas extends beyond military history into cultural understanding between nations. The bond formed between British officers and their Gurkha soldiers created lasting connections between Nepal and the United Kingdom. In the decades following the war, educational and development programs flourished, funded in part by veterans associations recognizing the debt owed to Nepal's warriors. In Germany, too, a strange respect evolved. Veterans groups occasionally hosted former Gurkha officers at remembrance events, acknowledging the professional respect that had emerged from the fear. A German mountain infantry veteran speaking at such an event in 1975 summed up this complex relationship. They were the enemies we could never bring ourselves to hate, only to fear. Perhaps because in them we recognized what true warriors should be, not machines of war as we had become, but men who brought their whole selves, their traditions and their honor to the battlefield. For the Gurkhas themselves, World War II represented just one chapter in a martial history spanning centuries. The kukri knives that had inspired such terror among German troops were returned to their ceremonial role in village life. Tools used for everything from building shelters to harvesting crops to sacrificial ceremonies. Yet they remained, as always, ready to be unsheathed should duty call again. In the mountain villages of Nepal, the legacy is preserved in folk songs and dances that commemorate not just World War II but 2 centuries of Gurkha service. Young boys still grow up hearing tales of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers who fought in distant lands. Many still dream of following that path, of proving themselves worthy of the crossed kukri badge that marks a Gurkha soldier. And in military academies worldwide, the tactics and psychological impact of the Gurkhas in World War II are still studied, as a prime example of how specialized forces can have an impact far beyond their numerical strength. The German experience against the Gurkhas serves as a case study in how reputation and specialized skills can become force multipliers on the battlefield. The story of why German officers begged not to face the Gurkhas is ultimately not just a tale of military history but a testament to the power of warrior tradition in an age of industrial warfare. In the mountains of Italy, ancient virtues confronted modern war machinery, and for a time at least, the ancient virtues prevailed. The quiet men from Nepal had come to a foreign continent to fight for a foreign empire, yet they brought with them something uniquely their own, a tradition of warfare that transformed them from colonial subjects into some of the most feared and respected soldiers of the Second World War. Their legacy lives on in military tradition, in diplomatic relations, in cultural exchange, and in the continuing service of Gurkha battalions with the British Army. And somewhere in the rugged hills of Italy, kukri marks can still be found on ancient trees and weathered rocks, silent testaments to those who came from the roof of the world to become the nightmare of the Third Reich. The true depth of German fear toward the Gurkhas was revealed in captured personal diaries, many of which remained classified in British military archives until decades after the war. One such document, the Journal of Hauptmann Karl Weissmann of the 1st Mountain Division, contained entries that military historians would later cite as evidence of the psychological warfare unwittingly waged by these Nepalese warriors. April 18, 1944. We have been moved to a new defensive line near Casino. Rumors are spreading that Gurkha units have been sighted in the sector. Already 3 men have reported sick this morning. I suspect malingering but cannot prove it. The mere mention of these fighters from Nepal has an effect on morale I have not witnessed with any other Allied force. 3 days later, Weissman wrote, "The night watch reported strange sounds in the ravine below our position. No visual confirmation of enemy presence, but 2 sentries refused to return to their posts, claiming they heard the distinctive sound of kukri knives being sharpened on stone. I had them placed under arrest, but privately, I too heard something in the darkness, a rhythmic scraping that cannot be explained by natural sounds. The Gurkha practice of ostentatiously sharpening their kukri knives within earshot of enemy positions was a deliberate psychological tactic. British officers initially discouraged this as it sacrificed the element of surprise, but they soon recognized its value in deteriorating enemy morale. German soldiers reported being unable to sleep due to the distinctive sound carrying through mountain valleys at night, a sound many came to associate with imminent attack. Oberstleutnant Gerhard Müller, a military psychologist attached to Army Group C in Italy, documented the unique stress symptoms displayed by soldiers who had faced Gurkha units. His confidential report to High Command in January 1945 noted, "Unlike conventional combat fatigue, which typically manifests after prolonged artillery bombardment or sustained combat operations, what we observe in units opposing Gurkha formations is acute anxiety preceding actual engagement. Men report sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, and in extreme cases, auditory hallucinations, believing they hear movement in perfectly still conditions. Miller's recommendations were pragmatic but revealing. Rotation of units facing known Gurkha positions should occur every 3 weeks rather than the standard 6. Night operations in these sectors should be conducted by specially trained units or not at all. Standard infantry formations show marked degradation of effectiveness after approximately 10 to 12 days in direct opposition to these specialized enemy units. The physical characteristics of the Gurkhas contributed significantly to German apprehension. Accustomed to facing enemies of similar or greater height, German soldiers found themselves outmaneuvered by fighters who averaged just 165 centimeters tall, but possessed extraordinary strength and endurance. This height advantage in mountain warfare became a tactical liability for the Germans. In the close confines of mountain trails, a taller soldier presented a larger target and often struggled to bring weapons to bear effectively against a shorter, quicker opponent attacking from below. Feldwebel Ernst Jünger, a decorated veteran of both World Wars and noted author, wrote in his private correspondence, "The physical disparity creates a disturbing dynamic in close-quarter fighting. Our men, trained to use their reach advantage with bayonets, find themselves at a loss when facing opponents who move inside their guard with frightening speed. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. It is deeply unsettling to find one's physical advantages nullified or even reversed." The Gurkhas' physical conditioning, developed through lifetimes spent navigating the steep terrains of Nepal, gave them capabilities that seemed superhuman to European observers. Reports frequently mentioned their ability to move at jogging pace up inclines that left other troops gasping, often while carrying full combat loads. A British liaison officer attached to the 6th Gurkha Rifles documented a march during which his Gurkha unit covered 55 kilometers of mountain terrain in a single 24-hour period, arriving at their objective not only on time but in condition to immediately engage the enemy. This endurance extended beyond mere movement to combat effectiveness. Unlike many troops whose accuracy and judgment degraded severely after physical exertion, Gurkha soldiers maintained precision and tactical awareness even after extended approach marches. German after-action reports frequently noted with dismay that even when they detected Gurkha units approaching and engaged them at distance, the firefights that followed showed no evidence of fatigue affecting enemy performance. Cultural differences magnified the psychological impact. European military traditions emphasized discipline, technological advantage, and coordinated action. The Gurkha approach to warfare, while incorporating modern training and equipment, remained rooted in a more ancient warrior ethos that prioritized individual prowess, close combat skills, and an acceptance of mortality that many Western soldiers found alien and unsettling. This cultural divide was evident in approaches to night fighting. German doctrine treated darkness as a challenging condition requiring special training and equipment to overcome. For Gurkha soldiers, night simply offered natural advantages to be exploited. Growing up in remote mountain villages without electrical lighting, they possessed natural night vision adaptation and spatial awareness that technical training could not replicate. German night vision equipment of the era, limited to infrared scopes mounted on select weapons, proved nearly useless against opponents who moved through darkness with intuitive ease. Lieutenant Hans Schiller of the Wehrmacht's 5th Mountain Division described the difference succinctly in his debriefing after the Monte Cassino campaign. "We use the night by overcoming it with technology and training. They simply use the night because they belong to it in ways we cannot understand. It is the difference between a man wearing a coat against the cold and a wolf who needs no coat because the fur is part of him." The Gurkhas' reputation among German forces was further enhanced by their apparent immunity to conventional propaganda. Psychological warfare operations that had proven effective against other Allied units, broadcasting surrender appeals, dropping leaflets highlighting home front suffering, or emphasizing the futility of continuing resistance, had no discernible effect on Gurkha morale or performance. A classified assessment by the Wehrmacht's propaganda department concluded, "Appeals based on homesickness are ineffective against soldiers whose concept of service apparently precludes such sentiment. Emphasis on casualty rates fails against troops who display no conventional fear of death. Standard demoralization techniques should not be wasted on these units." This psychological resilience was partly explained by the Gurkhas' motivational framework. While many Allied soldiers fought from patriotism, ideological commitment, or simply to survive and return home, the Gurkhas fought primarily from a cultural identity as warriors and a profound personal commitment to their unit and officers. Concepts of izzat, honor, and qaida, tradition, provided motivational foundations that propaganda could not undermine. The distinctive Gurkha battle cry, Ayo Gorkhali, became a sound that German veterans would recall with visceral dread decades after the war. Unlike the organized mass shouts used by other forces, the Gurkha cry often came just seconds before contact, a rising, throaty sound that froze defenders in place during the critical moments when reaction was most needed. Unterscharführer Wilhelm Brenner, an SS mountain trooper transferred to Italy in late 1943, wrote in a letter home that was later captured by Allied forces. "We had been briefed about their famous war cry, but nothing prepares you for actually hearing it in the darkness. It seems to come from everywhere at once, and in that moment, even the bravest men hesitate. That hesitation, even for just seconds, is usually the last mistake one makes when they are coming." The kukri knife itself deserves special mention in understanding the psychological impact of Gurkha forces. Unlike the standard-issue bayonets of other infantry, the kukri was not merely a weapon, but a cultural symbol with spiritual significance to its bearer. German intelligence briefings attempted to demystify it as merely a curved knife, but soldiers who had witnessed it in action shared a different perspective. The kukri's distinctive forward curve made it extraordinarily effective for the downward, diagonal strike favored by Gurkha fighters. This design channeled the force of the blow in a manner that conventional straight blades could not match. Medical officers treating German casualties of Gurkha attacks noted the distinctive wound patterns, deep, curved lacerations that often severed bone due to the concentrated force and weight of the blade. A medical report from a field hospital near Rimini contained this clinical observation. Wounds consistent with kukri strikes demonstrate a concerning pattern. Unlike bayonet wounds, which typically create puncture traumas, or conventional knife wounds which slice tissue, these injuries combine both crushing and cutting damage. The victims show defensive wounds, indicating they attempted to block strikes, but the blade's momentum carried through defensive postures. The kukri's effectiveness was not limited to combat. Its utility as a tool for everything from clearing brush to preparing meals to building shelters meant that Gurkha soldiers maintained constant familiarity with the weapon. While European troops might drill with bayonets periodically, Gurkha soldiers handled their kukris daily, developing an intuitive understanding of its balance, cutting angles, and capabilities that translated directly to combat proficiency. Tales of the kukri's supernatural properties circulated widely among German troops. The most common was the belief that once drawn, a kukri could not be resheathed until it had tasted blood. If no enemy was available, the wielder would nick his own thumb to satisfy this requirement. While British officers recognized this as folklore rather than actual practice, they made no effort to correct the misconception, understanding its value in psychological warfare. The mystique surrounding the weapon extended to its creation. Rumors spread of elaborate forging rituals, special metals mined from Himalayan peaks, and blade-making secrets passed through generations of specialized craftsmen. The reality that each kukri was indeed handcrafted by hereditary blacksmiths called kamis in Nepalese villages was impressive enough without embellishment. Intelligence officer Walter Hoffmann, tasked with creating a comprehensive assessment of Gurkha capabilities for German High Command, concluded his otherwise technical report with this personal observation. There exists a bond between these soldiers and their unique weapon that our men find disturbing. A German soldier is taught that his rifle is his best friend, but it remains a tool. For these Nepalese fighters, their knife appears to be an extension of themselves. This subtle difference manifests in combat effectiveness that exceeds what training alone can explain. The fighting at Sant'Arcangelo in September 1944 provided one of the most dramatic demonstrations of Gurkha capabilities and their psychological impact on German forces. The 8th Indian Division, including the 1-5 Gurkha Rifles, was tasked with securing high ground overlooking the Rimini-Bologna highway. German forces had established well-prepared defensive positions, including concrete bunkers, overlapping fields of fire, and extensive minefields. Initial British assaults had been repulsed with heavy casualties. Rather than continue frontal attacks, the Gurkha battalion proposed a night operation to infiltrate the German lines, targeting command positions and heavy weapons emplacements. The operation began with a highly unusual request from the Gurkha commanding officer. He asked that Allied artillery, which typically provided covering fire, remain silent. Moving in teams of 3, Gurkha infiltrators navigated through gaps in German positions identified by previous reconnaissance. The operation's official after-action report, declassified in 1975, documented the results with military precision. Enemy casualties, 87 confirmed killed, predominantly in command and heavy weapons positions. Own casualties, 3 wounded. Objectives secured by 0430 hours. German counterattack capabilities effectively neutralized, allowing main force advance with minimal resistance. What the report didn't capture was the psychological aftermath. German prisoners taken the following morning were described as unusually compliant and displaying symptoms consistent with extreme sleep deprivation. Interrogations revealed that many had not slept for over 72 hours, maintaining constant watch for fear of Gurkha night raids. This extended sleep deprivation significantly impaired their combat effectiveness when the main Allied assault came. A German radio man, Gefreiter Otto Müller, was captured during this operation. His interrogation transcript provides insight into the German perspective. We knew they were coming, had been told to expect night infiltration based on previous patterns. Our lieutenant ordered triple sentries and flares positioned every 20 meters. We thought we were prepared. When asked what went wrong, his answer was simple. They came through gaps we didn't know existed. The first we knew was when the machine gun positions went silent one by one. The systematic nature of Gurkha operations contributed significantly to their psychological impact. Unlike commando raids, which typically struck targets of opportunity before withdrawing, Gurkha infiltrations followed recognizable patterns that German forces began to anticipate with dread. They typically began with the elimination of forward sentries, followed by systematic dismantling of heavy weapons positions, communication facilities, and finally command posts. This predictability, rather than reducing effectiveness, actually enhanced the psychological pressure on defenders. German soldiers knew what was coming but seemed unable to prevent it. A defensive assessment prepared by the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division noted with frustration. Despite implementing all recommended countermeasures, infiltration success rates against our positions remain unacceptably high when facing these specific enemy units. The knowledge that they will target command facilities creates significant stress among headquarters personnel, affecting decision-making and communications efficiency. The effectiveness of Gurkha operations led to their deliberate use as force multipliers by Allied commanders. When planning major offensives, they would often deploy Gurkha battalions at key points to create breakthroughs that larger conventional forces could exploit. The official history of the Italian campaign, compiled by the British War Office, contained this assessment. The effect of Gurkha units on enemy morale was such that their presence on a divisional frontage often fixed disproportionate enemy reserves in place, creating opportunities elsewhere. German intelligence eventually identified specific Gurkha battalions by their operational patterns, tracking their movements with special attention. The 2.6 Gurkha rifles became particularly notorious for their specialization in targeting artillery positions, developing techniques to locate and neutralize gun emplacements with remarkable efficiency. Artillery units facing them began constructing elaborate defensive perimeters and rotating gun positions nightly, drastically reducing their operational effectiveness even before direct contact occurred. The 1-2 Gurkha rifles earned the German nickname Kommandojäger, command hunters, for their focus on headquarters elements. Their operations typically targeted officers and communications, creating leadership vacuums that paralyzed German responses to conventional attacks that followed. By 1945, some German officers in the Italian theater had taken to relocating their command posts nightly and minimizing identifying insignia when Gurkha units were identified in their sector. Ironically, the very effectiveness of Gurkha operations sometimes created tensions within Allied forces. American commanders, while respecting Gurkha capabilities, occasionally expressed frustration that German units facing their sectors seemed to fight with greater determination than those that had been broken by Gurkha action and subsequently transferred. A confidential assessment by an American liaison officer noted, German units previously engaged with Gurkha battalions display distinct characteristics. When redeployed against our forces, heightened aggression seemingly born of desperation rather than tactical judgment. The specialized equipment and modified tactics employed by Gurkha units deserve examination in understanding their effectiveness. Unlike conventional infantry, Gurkha battalions often operated with minimal heavy equipment, prioritizing mobility over firepower. They favored lightweight automatic weapons, particularly the Bren light machine gun and Sten submachine gun, modified for reduced sound signature. Their ability to move and sustain operations in difficult terrain was enhanced by adaptations of traditional Nepalese carrying methods. Where conventional troops struggled with standard military backpacks on steep slopes, Gurkha soldiers often employed a traditional carrying system called namlo, a headstrap arrangement that distributed weight more effectively on ascents. This allowed them to transport heavier loads through terrain that would exhaust conventional infantry. A German mountain warfare instructor, captured in the final months of the war, expressed professional admiration during his interrogation. Their equipment adaptations show deep understanding of vertical warfare principles that our own mountain units could benefit from studying. The traditional methods they incorporate are sometimes more effective than our advanced military designs. British officers commanding Gurkha units developed a distinct leadership approach that contributed to their effectiveness. Unlike the strict hierarchical model prevalent in European armies, they adopted what would now be recognized as a more collaborative style, incorporating the tactical insights of experienced Gurkha NCOs in planning operations. This created operational flexibility that German defenders found difficult to counter. Major James Holden, who commanded a company of the 3-9 Gurkha Rifles during the Italian campaign, wrote in his memoirs, "The standard military practice was to develop a plan at officer level and then brief the men who would execute it. With the Gurkhas, I found greatest success when incorporating the suggestions of my senior riflemen, particularly regarding night approaches and infiltration points. They possessed an intuitive understanding of terrain that no formal training could provide. The integration of traditional fighting techniques with modern military doctrine created hybrid tactical approaches that German defenders struggled to counter. While trained in conventional Allied infantry tactics, Gurkha units retained distinctive elements of their martial heritage. This was particularly evident in close-quarter fighting, where they eschewed the standard bayonet techniques taught to other British forces in favor of their traditional kukri fighting methods. British training officers seconded to a Gurkha battalion described this integration. They absorbed the technical aspects of modern warfare, machine gun placement, fire and movement, communication protocols, but retained their ancestral approach to the close fight. The result was something unique in modern military experience: fighters who could operate sophisticated weapons platforms but, when necessary, engage with a primal directness that European soldiers found deeply unsettling. The reputation of Gurkha units created cascading effects on German operational capabilities beyond direct engagements. Intercepted communications revealed that transportation and supply units began refusing night movements through sectors where Gurkha forces operated. This created significant logistical challenges, as resupply operations had to be conducted during daylight hours when they were more vulnerable to Allied air power. A German quartermaster's report from February 1945 noted, "Driver reluctance to traverse sections 14 through 17 during darkness has reduced delivery efficiency by approximately 65%. Despite disciplinary measures, incidents of vehicles returning to depot without delivering supplies, drivers claiming impassable conditions which reconnaissance subsequently disproves, continue to increase. The psychological impact extended to medical services. Field hospitals reported increasing cases of what they classified as anticipatory combat stress, anxiety symptoms appearing in soldiers who had not yet engaged in combat but had been deployed to sectors where Gurkha units operated. Medical officers noted that these symptoms typically appeared in men with previous combat experience rather than raw recruits, indicating that experienced soldiers understood the threat more acutely than newcomers. Dr. Klaus Werner, a psychiatrist attached to the German 10th Army, documented this phenomenon in a medical study conducted during the war. Unlike conventional combat stress, which typically manifests after traumatic experience, we observe increasing cases of acute anxiety preceding actual combat among units deployed against Nepali mountain troops. Experienced soldiers paradoxically display higher incidence rates than recent replacements, suggesting knowledge rather than ignorance exacerbates the condition. The coping mechanisms developed by German units facing Gurkha forces ranged from the practical to the superstitious. Some were tactical adaptations, increased sentry positions, reduced patrol sizes, and greater reliance on prepared defensive positions rather than maneuver warfare. Others reflected deeper psychological impacts. Amulets claimed to provide protection against kukri blades, complex recognition protocols to guard against infiltrators, and in some cases, unauthorized withdrawal from positions upon hearing rumors of Gurkha presence. As Allied forces pushed northward through Italy in 1945, the cumulative psychological effect on German forces became increasingly evident. Interrogation of prisoners revealed that many units now considered assignment to the Italian front, once viewed as preferable to the Eastern Front, as a dreaded posting due largely to the presence of Gurkha formations. Hauptmann Werner Müller, captured near Bologna in April 1945, expressed a sentiment common among officer prisoners. "We had a saying in the officer corps, better a Soviet tank than a Gurkha patrol. The Russians kill you cleanly with firepower. The Gurkhas hunt you personally in the darkness." The psychological difference cannot be overstated. As Germany approached defeat, senior commanders began acknowledging the special challenges posed by Gurkha units. Field Marshal Kesselring, in his final directive to Army Group C dated April 21, 1945, included this remarkable assessment. "Our forces have withstood superior enemy numbers and material for 2 years in this theater. They have faced American industrial might and British determination with professional valor. Only against the mountain troops of the Indian divisions have we found ourselves at a consistent disadvantage that technical superiority cannot overcome." The legacy of the Gurkhas' impact extended well beyond the war. German military studies conducted under Allied supervision in the immediate post-war period paid particular attention to the psychological warfare lessons of the Italian campaign. The Gurkha example became a case study in how specialized forces could have strategic impacts disproportionate to their numerical strength, a comprehensive analysis prepared by former Wehrmacht psychological operations specialists concluded. The most significant tactical advantage displayed by these units was not their combat techniques or equipment, but their ability to create a psychological environment that degraded enemy performance before physical contact occurred. This represents an aspect of warfare that our military doctrine had largely overlooked. For the Gurkhas themselves, the Italian campaign represented just one chapter in a martial history spanning centuries and continuing to the present day. Their service with the British Army would continue through the Malayan Emergency, the Borneo Confrontation, the Falklands War, and more recent deployments to the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Victoria Cross citations, Britain's highest military honor, provide insight into the qualities that made Gurkha soldiers so formidable. During World War II alone, Gurkha regiments received 12 Victoria Crosses, a remarkable number for units comprising a relatively small portion of overall British forces. The citations repeatedly emphasized not just courage but a particular quality of unhesitating commitment to action, regardless of personal risk. Rifleman Lacheman Gurung's Victoria Cross, awarded for action in Burma in 1945, typifies these qualities. When Japanese grenades landed in his trench, he threw 2 back and attempted to throw a third, which exploded in his hand. Despite losing his right arm and sustaining severe wounds to his face and body, he continued firing his rifle with his left hand, single-handedly holding the position against repeated attacks until reinforcements arrived the following morning. Such accounts, filtering back to German forces through intelligence briefings and prisoner exchanges, reinforced the perception that these were warriors of a different caliber. A German intelligence assessment noted, "These actions cannot be explained by conventional military psychology. Our understanding of motivation based on ideology, patriotism, or unit cohesion fails to account for this level of individual determination." The post-war relationship between Germany and Nepal developed unusual dimensions due to the wartime reputation of Gurkha soldiers. German mountaineering expeditions to the Himalayas often reported extraordinary hospitality in Nepalese villages when locals discovered their nationality. Far from harboring resentment, Nepalese civilians displayed pride that their warriors had earned such respect from a formidable adversary. Edmund Hillary, who would later make the first confirmed summit of Mount Everest, observed during early reconnaissance expeditions. In the hill villages, German visitors were often treated with particular interest. The elders would produce war souvenirs, Luger pistols, Wehrmacht badges, even officers' daggers, and through interpreters, engage in detailed discussions of battles fought a continent away. There seemed a curious bond of mutual respect that transcended the former enemy status. This respect flowed both ways. When Nepal suffered a devastating earthquake in 1934, one of the first international aid organizations to respond was a German mountaineering association with members who had served in Italy. Their stated reason was simple. We face their warriors with honor. We will help their families with equal honor. The cultural exchange continued through mountaineering. German climbing techniques and equipment designs found eager adoption among Nepalese Sherpa guides, while German climbers studied the load-carrying methods and high-altitude adaptations of their Nepalese counterparts. This technical exchange had its roots in wartime observations. German mountain troops had noted with professional interest the superior mountain craft of their Gurkha opponents. Historical assessment of the Gurkhas' impact in World War II has evolved over decades. Initial military studies focused primarily on tactical innovations and specialized training. More recent scholarship has increasingly recognized the psychological dimension as perhaps their most significant contribution to Allied victory in Italy. Military historian Professor Michael Howard, in his comprehensive analysis, The Mediterranean Strategy in the Second World War, offered this assessment. The Gurkha regiments represent a unique case study in force multiplication through reputation. Their actual numbers, never more than a few thousand men in the Italian theater, cannot explain their strategic impact. It was their psychological effect on enemy forces that transformed them from simply excellent infantry into a strategic asset. The enduring nature of the Gurkhas' reputation is perhaps best illustrated by a statement from a Taliban commander in Afghanistan, recorded nearly 70 years after World War II. When asked which NATO forces he most feared facing, he replied without hesitation, "The British with the hats." He was referring to the distinctive wide-brimmed hats that remain part of Gurkha ceremonial dress, recognizable symbols of warriors whose reputation has spanned centuries and continues into modern conflicts. In the mountain villages of Nepal, the legacy continues. Each year, thousands of young men compete for a few hundred positions in today's brigade of Gurkhas. The selection process remains among the most demanding in any military worldwide, testing not just physical prowess, but the distinctive combination of courage, resourcefulness, and unstinting commitment that made their forebears so formidable. The central question, why German officers begged not to face the Gurkhas, ultimately has an answer both simple and profound. They had encountered something beyond their military experience. Warriors for whom combat was not merely a duty or profession, but an expression of cultural identity and personal honor stretching back through generations. In the industrial warfare of the 20th century, they had met an ancient martial spirit that their modern military doctrine could neither categorize nor counter. As a Gurkha veteran of the Italian campaign, Rifleman Bhim Bahadur Thapa expressed it decades later. We did not think of ourselves as special. We were simply doing what our fathers and grandfathers had done before us, fighting with complete heart. If this created fear in our enemies, that was their concern, not ours. A Gurkha does not fight to frighten. He fights to win. The sound of a kukri being drawn from its sheath may no longer echo through the mountains of Italy. But in military academies worldwide, the psychological impact of the Gurkhas remains a subject of study. German veterans who faced them carried the experience for a lifetime, often expressing a complex mixture of fear and professional respect that transcended the usual boundaries between former enemies. Perhaps most telling is that when asked about their wartime experiences decades later, German veterans who had faced American firepower, British determination, and Russian numbers would often pause longest when conversation turned to the quiet men from Nepal who moved through the darkness with curved knives and unwavering purpose. Some wounds heal with time, some memories fade, But some fears, once embedded in the soul, remain forever. The legacy of why German officers begged not to face the Gurkhas is not just a fascinating footnote in military history. It is a reminder that in warfare, as in all human endeavors, the psychological often transcends the physical, and ancient virtues sometimes prove more powerful than modern innovations. In the mountains of Italy, the warriors of Nepal wrote their chapter in the history of World War II, not with superior weapons or numbers, but with the commitment to a warrior tradition that transformed them from mere soldiers into living legends. And in the quiet mountain villages of Nepal today, young men still dream of following that tradition, of earning the right to wear the crossed kukri badge, and of living up to the legacy of those who came before, the warriors whose very name caused the officers of the Third Reich to beg for different assignments, and whose actions earned them a place of honor in the martial history of the world. In the decades following World War II, previously classified documents gradually became available to historians, revealing deeper dimensions of the Gurkhas' impact on German forces. Among the most significant were the personal papers of General Heinrich von Wittinghoff, who succeeded Kesselring as commander of German forces in Italy in March 1945. His private journal, released to the German Federal Archives in 1978, contained entries that military historians would later describe as unprecedented in their candor about enemy capabilities. An entry dated April 8, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, read, "The deterioration of our defensive capability cannot be attributed solely to material shortages or Allied numerical superiority. A specific psychological factor has emerged in sectors facing Gurkha units that conventional military analysis struggles to quantify. My division commanders report a phenomenon they term anticipatory paralysis. Defensive positions being abandoned based on mere intelligence reports of Gurkha deployment before any actual contact occurs." Von Wittinghoff's final operational directive to his corps commanders contained an extraordinary passage that military historians would later cite as evidence of institutional acknowledgement of this psychological dimension. When planning defensive deployments, special consideration must be given to the unique challenges presented by specialized Indian mountain units. Conventional units deployed against these formations must receive additional artillery support, enhanced communication capabilities, and more frequent rotation than standard doctrine dictates. Where possible, elite mountain units should be prioritized for these sectors. The Allied advance through northern Italy in the spring of 1945 revealed the cumulative effect of years of psychological pressure. German units that had maintained cohesion and fighting effectiveness against overwhelming conventional forces frequently disintegrated when facing Gurkha battalions. The 10th Mountain Division, Wehrmacht, considered among Germany's elite specialized units, suffered particularly dramatic collapse during engagements in the Po Valley in April 1945. The division's after-action report, compiled by its operations officer just days before Germany's surrender, contained this remarkable admission. Despite specialized training and equipment for mountain warfare, our tactical effectiveness against Nepali infantry formations remained consistently below acceptable standards. Conventional defensive doctrine proved inadequate against their infiltration methods. More concerning was the marked degradation in unit cohesion that occurred when men believed these specific enemy units were operating in our sector. The battle for Medicina in April 1945 provided one of the final and most dramatic demonstrations of Gurkha effectiveness. German forces had established a defensive line along the Guyana Canal with prepared positions, extensive minefields, and pre-registered artillery support. The position was considered highly defensible based on conventional military assessment, and initial Allied probing attacks were repulsed with heavy casualties. Rather than continue frontal assaults, the Allied command deployed the 6th Gurkha Rifles in a night infiltration operation. Moving in small teams through gaps identified by aerial reconnaissance, they bypassed forward defensive positions and established positions behind German lines before the main assault. When Allied forces launched their primary attack the following morning, German defenders found their communication lines cut, heavy weapons positions neutralized, and command structures in disarray. The operation's official after-action report documented the results with clinical precision. Enemy resistance collapsed after approximately 75 minutes of engagement. Prisoner count exceeded expectations by 347%. Analysis of prisoner interviews indicates widespread surrender occurred not due to ammunition depletion or casualty rates, but from the psychological impact of discovering Gurkha units had penetrated positions previously considered secure. A German officer captured during this action, Hauptmann Wilhelm Fischer, provided insight during his interrogation. We had prepared extensively for defense against frontal assault. Artillery firing positions were camouflaged, machine gun nests had interlocking fields of fire, and minefields were laid according to textbook patterns. None of this mattered when we discovered they had somehow moved through our lines during the night. The realization that they could be anywhere, that the security of our position was an illusion. The effect on morale was immediate and irreversible. The Gurkhas' battlefield effectiveness stemmed not just from their fighting prowess, but from their extraordinary situational awareness and adaptability. British officers commanding Gurkha units frequently noted their ability to intuitively understand terrain and exploit microfeatures that conventional military maps failed to capture. This natural terrain reading allowed them to identify infiltration routes that German defenders, even those with specialized mountain training, overlooked. Major Richard Williams of the 2.8 Gurkha Rifles documented this capability in his operational journal. Asked a young rifleman how he had identified the approach route used in last night's raid. His answer was revealing. He had observed birds flushing in a particular pattern when patrols passed, indicating a natural channel through the broken ground that did not appear on our maps. This level of environmental awareness cannot be taught in conventional military training. It comes from lifetimes spent in mountain environments. The distinctive Gurkha approach to reconnaissance deserves particular attention in understanding their effectiveness. Unlike conventional military scouting, which typically emphasized observation from concealment, Gurkha reconnaissance patrols frequently operated through what modern military doctrine would term aggressive reconnaissance, actively probing defensive positions to gauge responses before withdrawing. German Signals Intelligence Report from January 1945 noted this pattern with concern. Identified enemy reconnaissance methods differ significantly from standard British practice. Rather than maintaining observation positions, these specialized units conduct deliberate probing actions, often penetrating outer defensive perimeters before withdrawing. This approach provides them superior intelligence regarding our defensive arrangements but makes early detection of their main effort problematic. The effectiveness of Gurkha units against German mountain troops, formations specifically trained for Alpine warfare, particularly concerned German high command. The Wehrmacht's Gebirgsjäger mountain infantry divisions had specialized equipment, extensive training in vertical warfare, and were considered among the German Army's elite formations. Their consistent underperformance against Gurkha units defied conventional military explanation. A classified assessment prepared for General Feldmarschall Kesselring in December 1944 attempted to address this discrepancy. Our mountain infantry receives extensive technical training in climbing, survival, and specialized alpine tactics. The Nepali troops appear to require no such training. They operate in mountainous terrain with natural fluency that our most experienced alpinists cannot match. The psychological advantage this creates cannot be overcome through conventional training or equipment adjustments. The integration of Gurkha battalions into larger Allied operations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of their psychological impact. British planners frequently deployed them not where their specific capabilities were most needed, but where their presence would create maximum disruption to German defensive planning. Simply inserting a single Gurkha company into a predominantly conventional attack could dramatically alter German response patterns across a much wider front. Brigadier William Richardson, who served as operations officer for the British Eighth Army in the final months of the Italian campaign, described this approach in his post-war analysis. We learned to use Gurkha units as what would now be termed force multipliers. Their presence on even a narrow frontage would typically fix disproportionate German reserves in place through the psychological impact alone. This created exploitation opportunities elsewhere that conventional numerical analysis would not predict. The distinctive weapons culture of Gurkha units contributed significantly to their battlefield effectiveness and psychological impact. While trained in all standard infantry weapons, they maintained a relationship with their primary close combat tool, the kukri, that transcended conventional military attachment to equipment. For Gurkha soldiers, the kukri was not merely a Weapon, but a cultural artifact with spiritual significance. This relationship manifested in combat effectiveness that German observers found difficult to contextualize within European military frameworks. A Wehrmacht study of close-quarter combat casualties noted with clinical detachment. Wounds inflicted by the distinctive curved knives of Nepali troops display consistent precision regarding anatomical targeting. Unlike typical infantry-edged weapon attacks, which demonstrate wide variability in placement and effectiveness, these wounds show remarkable consistency in targeting major blood vessels and vulnerable anatomical junctures. What the report failed to capture was the underlying reason for this consistency. The kukri was not merely a military-issued weapon but an integral part of Gurkha cultural identity. Young men from Nepal's hills learned kukri handling from childhood, using the versatile tool for everything from woodcutting to food preparation. By the time they enlisted, the weapon's balance, cutting angles, and optimal employment were so deeply internalized that they required no conscious calculation in combat applications. This weapon's mastery extended to adaptive use of standard military equipment. German after-action reports frequently noted the Gurkhas' distinctive employment of conventional weapons in unorthodox ways. Particularly concerning to German tacticians was their use of the PAT, projector, infantry anti-tank, primarily designed as an anti-armor weapon, as an impromptu demolition device against bunkers and defensive positions. A technical assessment prepared by German combat engineers in November 1944 observed, enemy employment of anti-tank weapons against defensive infrastructure demonstrates concerning adaptability. Rather than utilizing standard demolition charges which require close approach, they have modified armor-penetrating munitions for use against reinforced positions from standoff distances. This technique, primarily observed among Nepali units, indicates a tactical creativity our defensive doctrine has not adequately accounted for. The Gurkhas' reputation among German troops gave rise to a rich folklore that further amplified their psychological impact. Stories spread through German units of Gurkhas' supernatural capabilities, ability to see in absolute darkness, communicate without sound, and move without disturbing their surroundings. While military leaders recognized these as exaggerations, they made little effort to counter such beliefs, understanding their value in maintaining discipline. Feldwebel Johannes Müller, a German NCO captured during operations near Florence in August 1944, provided insight into this folklore during his interrogation. The new replacements arrive having already heard stories. They believe these soldiers can smell a man's fear, can move through minefields without triggering explosions, can kill without leaving traces. Veterans don't correct these ideas. Better the replacements remain hypervigilant than complacent. What German intelligence eventually recognized was that while many specific claims were exaggerated, the underlying assessment of Gurkha capabilities was essentially accurate. They indeed possessed night vision superior to European soldiers due to physiological adaptation to Himalayan conditions. They did employ nonverbal communication systems derived from hunting practices, and their movement techniques, developed through generations of mountain travel, minimized noise and disturbance to surroundings. German intelligence assessment from January 1945 concluded, separating factual capability from psychological warfare is increasingly difficult regarding these specific units. Claims initially dismissed as improbable have been subsequently verified through observation. This creates a problematic dynamic where even obviously implausible reports cannot be confidently discounted, further complicating defensive planning. The personal impact on German officers who faced Gurkha units was profound and lasting. Post-war interviews with Wehrmacht veterans revealed that many experienced recurring nightmares decades after the war, not of artillery bombardments or aerial attacks, but of silent infiltrators moving through darkness. This psychological trauma manifested even among officers who had faced combat on multiple fronts, including the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Weber, who commanded a regiment against Gurkha units in Italy before being transferred to the Eastern Front, offered this comparison in a 1975 interview. The Russians employed human wave attacks, terrifying but comprehensible. The Americans brought overwhelming firepower, devastating but impersonal. The Gurkhas brought a different kind of fear, intimate and personal. They did not seek to destroy positions. They sought to hunt individuals. This distinction may seem subtle, but its psychological impact was profound. The trauma experienced by German units who faced Gurkha formations frequently manifested in unusual protective behaviors. Intelligence reports noted increasing use of trip flares and noise-making devices around German positions, not primarily for tactical warning, but for psychological reassurance. Units in sectors where Gurkha battalions operated typically maintained illumination throughout the night despite the increased vulnerability to artillery observation. This created. A medical report from a field hospital near Rimini documented the psychological toll. Patients from sectors facing Indian mountain units display distinct anxiety patterns compared to general combat fatigue cases. They report sleep disturbances focused specifically on vulnerability during darkness, hypervigilance regarding sounds, and persistent sensation of being observed. Conventional treatment protocols show reduced effectiveness with these specific presentations. The final months of the Italian campaign revealed how deeply the fear of Gurkha units had penetrated German military thinking. As Allied forces pushed northward in spring 1945, German units frequently abandoned defensible positions without order when intelligence indicated Gurkha formations were approaching their sector. This pattern became so concerning that the German High Command issued a special directive imposing severe penalties for unauthorized withdrawal, specifically mentioning disproportionate response to specialized enemy units. The directive had limited effect. A signals intelligence report from April 18, 1945, captured this exchange between a German battalion commander and his regimental headquarters. Request immediate permission to adjust positions rearward. Reconnaissance confirms Gurkha elements moving in sector. The response was explicit, negative. Maintain positions as ordered. Fear of specific enemy units does not justify tactical adjustment. The subsequent reply was telling. With respect, headquarters personnel are not facing kukri knives in the darkness. We are adjusting positions regardless of authorization. As Germany approached defeat, a subtle shift occurred in how German commanders viewed their Gurkha opponents. Professional respect began to replace fear, particularly among officers with mountain warfare experience who could appreciate the exceptional skills displayed. This transition was captured in the final operational assessment prepared by General der Gebirgstruppe Hans Schlemmer, commander of German mountain forces in Italy. His report, completed just days before Germany's surrender, contained this remarkable passage. In the specialized domain of mountain warfare, where our forces have historically claimed expertise, we encountered in the Nepali units of the Indian Division's natural masters of the vertical battlefield. Their capabilities did not derive from technical training or equipment, but from cultural adaptation to mountain environments that European military systems cannot replicate. Future mountain warfare doctrine should study rather than dismiss their methods. The legacy of the Gurkhas' impact extended well beyond the war. German military reforms in the post-war period incorporated many lessons derived from their experiences against specialized forces. The Bundeswehr's special operations capabilities, particularly the Fernspeiler-Kompanie, long-range reconnaissance, drew directly on observations of Gurkha infiltration tactics. Training programs for mountain warfare units placed new emphasis on night operations and counter-infiltration measures. Perhaps the most significant legacy was philosophical rather than tactical. German military thinking, which had emphasized technological advantage and systematic doctrine, began incorporating greater recognition of the human element in warfare. The psychological dimension, which had been secondary in Wehrmacht doctrine, received increased emphasis in post-war German military education. Dr. Anton Schmidt, who served as a military psychologist during the Italian campaign before becoming a prominent academic in post-war Germany, summarized this shift. Our encounter with the Gurkhas forced a fundamental reassessment of military psychology. We had approached warfare as primarily a technical and doctrinal challenge, with human factors as secondary considerations. The Gurkhas demonstrated that psychology could become the decisive factor, rendering technical superiority irrelevant if the will to employ it effectively was compromised. For the Gurkhas themselves, their World War II experience became part of a proud regimental history that continues to influence their identity today. The actions in Italy joined earlier campaigns, from the Indian Rebellion of 1857 to the Northwest Frontier and 2 World Wars, in a martial tradition that shapes current service. Modern Gurkha soldiers serving with the British Army still study the mountain operations of their predecessors in the Italian campaign. This continuity is evident in the selection process for today's Brigade of Gurkhas, which still emphasizes the qualities that made their forebears so formidable: physical endurance, adaptability, and unstinting commitment. The famous Doko race, in which candidates carry 25 kilos of sand in a traditional bamboo basket up mountain slopes, evaluates not just physical strength but the mental determination that German forces found so daunting. The cultural foundation of Gurkha effectiveness remains consistent across generations. Lieutenant Colonel John Cross, a British officer who served with Gurkha regiments for decades after World War II, identified this continuity. The effectiveness of Gurkha soldiers cannot be explained through conventional military analysis. It derives from cultural values, courage, loyalty, and commitment that transcend military training. What German forces encountered in Italy was not merely skilled infantry but a warrior tradition, with roots deeper than modern military institutions. The story of why German officers begged not to face the Gurkhas ultimately transcends military history to illuminate broader human truths. In the mechanized slaughter of World War II, where industrial production often seemed the determining factor, the Gurkhas demonstrated that human qualities, courage, adaptability, commitment, could still prove decisive against material advantages. Their legacy is not just one of battlefield prowess, but of the enduring importance of the human spirit in warfare. A German veteran, interviewed for a documentary in the 1980s, perhaps expressed it most succinctly. "We had better weapons, better equipment, better supply systems. They had better warriors. In the end, that made all the difference." His voice, even decades later, still carried the mixture of fear and respect that characterized German responses to these remarkable soldiers from Nepal's mountains. Today, in the hills of Nepal, young men still dream of following in the footsteps of those who fought in distant Italy. The kukri knife remains both practical tool and symbol of identity. The crossed kukri badge of Gurkha regiments is still worn with immense pride, and in military academies worldwide, the story of these warriors continues to be studied as an object lesson in how specialized forces can have impacts far beyond their numerical strength. The mountains of Italy are peaceful now. The sounds of battle have long faded, but in the collective memory of those who study military history, the image remains vivid. Small, powerful men moving through darkness with curved knives and unwavering purpose, becoming the embodiment of fear for the armies of the Third Reich, and writing their chapter in the history of warfare not through superior technology or numbers, but through the ancient virtues of the warrior. In the final assessment, the answer to why German officers begged not to face the Gurkhas lies in a simple truth. They had encountered warriors who fought not merely with weapons and tactics, but with their entire cultural identity. Against such opponents, even the vaunted German military machine, with its technology, doctrine, and discipline, found itself at a disadvantage it could neither overcome nor fully comprehend. The lesson remains relevant for military planners today. In warfare, as in all human endeavors, spirit sometimes transcends material, and ancient virtues can prove more powerful than modern innovations. The legacy of the Gurkhas continues in today's conflicts, where modern Gurkha units serve with distinction in British operations worldwide. Their reputation remains formidable, their effectiveness undiminished. And somewhere in the rugged hills of Nepal, young men still train with the kukri, preparing to join a tradition that once struck fear into the hearts of the Wehrmacht's officers and continues to represent the finest traditions of the professional warrior, as a senior German officer wrote in his final assessment before the surrender in Italy. "In the Gurkhas, we encountered not an enemy to be hated, but an adversary to be respected. They fought with honor, courage, and skill that transcended the political causes of the conflict. If Germany should ever again find itself at war, I would hope our soldiers display similar qualities, and I would pray they do not face such opponents." The mountains of both Nepal and Italy have seen countless warriors come and go through the centuries, but few have left such a profound impression on their adversaries as the quiet men with kukri knives who moved through the darkness of the Italian campaign, becoming living legends and writing one of the most remarkable chapters in the long history of warfare. Their story endures not just as military history, but as a testament to human qualities that transcend time, technology, and cultural boundaries. The Gurkhas fought with more than weapons and tactics. They fought with identity, tradition, and unshakable commitment. And against such warriors, even the mighty Wehrmacht found itself outmatched, not in technology or numbers, but in the ancient virtues that ultimately define the true warrior. The German officers who begged not to face them had encountered something beyond their experience, warriors in the truest sense of the word. Their fear was not cowardice but recognition. In the industrial warfare of the 20th century, they had met an ancient warrior spirit that their modern military doctrine could neither categorize nor counter. And in that recognition lies the enduring lesson of the Gurkhas' impact on the battlefields of World War II. The legacy of the Gurkhas in World War II stands as a testament to how specialized forces can achieve impacts far beyond their numerical strength. From the mountains of Italy to the military academies of today, their story continues to be studied and remembered. German officers who once commanded panzer divisions and weathered the brutal Eastern Front would still speak in hushed tones about the quiet men with kukri knives who moved like shadows through the darkness. The story of why German officers begged not to face the Gurkhas is ultimately a reminder that in warfare, the human element, courage, adaptability, and unwavering commitment can overcome even the most advanced technology and disciplined formations. The Gurkhas fought not merely as soldiers but as warriors, carrying forward an ancient tradition that transformed them into living legends on the battlefields of World War II. Their kukris remain sheathed now, but the echo of their battle cry, Ayo Gorkali, still resonates through military history as a reminder of when the mighty Wehrmacht encountered warriors they could neither understand nor defeat. The end.